Hi. Okay, now once you have created your server and you made it run like what we have done here, the Postgresql server. So now the server is running. Now we need to do a few things. First of all, create a database, and then we create a role, and then we change the ownership. Now remember these three steps, this one and this one and this one, it has to be done on the terminal. It cannot be done in here. But I'm showing you the syntax how you can do it. So to create a database, you need to use the keywords create database, and then you give it a name, whichever name is suitable for you. The second thing, you need to create a role. A role, as we have said, is just a user. So any user is named by the database community as a role. Now in PostgreSQL, this is the syntax to create a role. It is create role, this is keywords, then give this role a name, whichever name suitable for you, then with, this is a keyword, and the rest is create DB, create role, login, replication, encrypt, and then password, and then this password you have to give it some value. So two things in all this line, this one and this one is you choose. The rest is all a keywords. The rest is all reserved. Now these things considered as the role characteristics. So this role can create a DB. This role can create a role, another role. This role can log in. If you, let's suppose that we delete the login, or actually more specifically, let's say delete encrypt. Now in this case, if we don't put this specification, then this role will not be able to use the encryption of the database. So encrypt same with the rest of create DB, create role, login, replication, encrypted, password. So create role, give it a name, with create DB, create role, login, replication, encrypted, password, and then give the password whichever suitable password for you. This is the second thing you need to do on the command line. Then when you create a database and you create a role, both of them, or when you create a database, in fact, it will be owned by the default user. You know, when you create a server in PostgreSQL, it will, by default, it will create a database by the name of Postgres, a default database by the name of Postgres, and a default role by the name also of Postgres. Afterward, whichever database you create, the owner of this database will be the default role, which is Postgres. So now, since we have created our own role, now we need to change the ownership of this database to be owned by this role. And the syntax to do this, alter database assignments owner to this role. So this is the database and this is the new owner. Okay, now these three steps you need to do them on the terminal. Now let's talk something about the role. Now, as we have said, each server will have many roles working with it. In general, any server can be connected by many roles, many users. That's the standard thing. Many users can connect to the server. Now, for each user, for each role, there will be a cluster assigned specifically to that role. And a cluster could have one or more database. Now you might wonder, what is the cluster? A cluster is actually a real space that is reside in the hard disk. It's like an object, a space, an area in the this in the hard disk. So this is the cluster, and the cluster usually contains one or more databases. Now for each role we create on this server, it will have its own cluster. No two roles share the same cluster. No two roles share same cluster. Each role should have its own cluster. That's one of the basics when you do with PostgreSQL, and in fact when you do with all databases. So multiple roles can connect to the server. Each role has its own cluster. The cluster could have one database or more. Now you might hear about the authentication and authorization. The authentication is the right to the user to log in to the database. To log in, you need to provide, let's say, an email and a password. This operation, when you check your email and password with the database, then I will give you the right to log in to the database. This is what's called the authentication. How about the authorization? Now the authorization is something totally different. The authorization is the privileges, the permissions that the role could have. Now what these permissions can do? Now the permissions, they are different. You could be a super user, could be administrator, could be a database manager, could be just a normal user. Now these permissions, you specify them in general. But these privileges that one role could have allow this role to change the cluster structure, and that's a very important point. For instance, one role could have a permission to create a new database, or to drop a database, or to revoke permission from another role, or probably drop a table from a database. So these things will change the cluster structure. These are what is called the privileges, the permissions. So the authorization is a set of privileges, permissions that's given to the role, and this by giving these permissions, the role can change the cluster structure. As we have said, can drop a table, drop a database entirely, revoke permissions from another role, and do many other things. So this is the authorization. Now you might hear about the pseudo user. The pseudo user is actually a user with admin privileges. So this user can access to other roles, can revoke them, can change passwords. This is a high privileges role. So it's a role with high privileges. Now let's move to another thing when we create the database, which is creating a schema. Now in PostgreSQL, you have to create a schema. Now the schema is just like a container where many tables can reside inside it. This is the schema. So it contains one or more table actually. Okay, so this is a schema. When you hear a schema, it's just a container that contains tables. In PostgreSQL, it's almost mandatory that you need to create a schema. Once you have created the database and the role, then you need immediately to create a schema. In MySQL, as far as I know, it's not mandatory. It's not required to create a schema when you work with MySQL. Now, if you have two tables in different schemas, how you can connect them? If you have tables in the same schema, these tables can connect normally without any requirement, without any special requirement. But if you have two tables in different schemas, here you need certain privileges to connect one table in one schema to another table in another schema. So the privileges need to be altered, need to be certain privileges. Now let's start the next step. After creating the schema, let's start with another thing, which is creating the required tables. Now the tables depends on your requirement. You can create 1, 2, 3, whatever number, that depends on your requirement. Now, by convention, we call the table as entity. So when you hear the word entity, that means it refers to a table. This is number one. The columns that you create in any table, in any entity, by convention we call them attributes. So the table is entity, the column is attribute. Now, for each column, we give, now when we create a table, these are the basic keywords, these are reserved keywords. Create table, then you give a name to the table. Whichever name suitable for you. Remember, in PostgreSQL, this is the table name preceded by the schema name. This is in PostgreSQL. In MySQL, as far as I know, there is no need to mention the schema name. Just you can mention the table name. But in PostgreSQL, this is the table name preceded by the schema name. So create table, schema dot table name. You can choose whichever table name suitable for you. Then you start creating the columns, the attributes. Okay, now once you have selected the names of the columns, the next thing to do is to give a data type for each column. A data type is actually, so let's see here. The data type is what kind of data will be inserted in this column. What kind of data? Now we know the data could be a text, could be numbers, integer, double or float, could be date, like day, month, year, could be a Boolean type, true, false. So the second thing you have to do after you're giving a column name is that you specify the text of this column. For instance, this first name, it has a text value, a text type, that data type. Here, the first name, you could see these are text characters, bunch of characters. Okay, same with the last name, it's just a text. While when we do the age, as you know, the age should be referenced by a number. A number, in this case, it's an integer. As you can see here, the age referenced by a number. That's the meaning of the type, the data type. Now there are multiple types. You can check them in the manuals of PostgreSQL. There are very good details on the manuals in about the data types. Another thing, after the data type, there are things you need to know. One of the things I advise you to do is to give a default value for each column. Assign it. For instance, this is a text. So when you want to give a default value for a text, you just make an empty string. This is an empty string. This refers to an empty string. Two quotes means it's an empty string. Same with here, two quotes, empty string. But for a number, whether it's an integer you should assign as a 0. The default for an integer is a 0. But for a double, let's say, it should be 0.0. By the way, when in PostgreSQL, when you assign a data type of double, you need to precision. You need to do this precision. It's mandatory. You have to give this precision value. So when you select a double type, then the default value will be 0.0. This is a double. This is a double. Okay, but when it's an integer, then 0 would be fine as a default value. Okay. Once you have done these things, now these things we will talk about later in another video. But this is the general idea when you create a table. Create table, give it a name, select the columns that you wish, the attributes that you wish to be in the column, give each column a data type, and then create it. Now you need to remember for few things, distinguished things between DBMS, between database management systems. Let's take a look at one of them. Here, we need to create an auto-incremented column. An auto-incremented column means the first column that will be auto-incremented automatically. So whenever you do any insert query, the new row will be given a sequential number. So the first row has been given, when we insert a new data, has been given a number of 1. When we enter a new row through an insert query, then number 2 will be given to the second row. And likewise, when you insert a new row, number 3 will be given. So here, this is the first column, which is usually it's an ID for that table. So here there is something distinguished between the DBMS. In PostgreSQL, we use the type serial. Serial means it's auto-increment column. Auto-increment column. So whenever you use serial, this column will be auto-incremented automatically. But in MySQL, the syntax is different. The syntax will be like this. To get an auto-increment column, the syntax will be like this. For instance, integer, auto-increment. So you see, in MySQL, this is an auto-incremented column. Both ways, both syntaxes do the same job, do the same result. We'll create a column that is auto-incremented, but the syntax here, difference between these two DBMS, between the MySQL and the PostgreSQL. So you need to give attention to which DBMS you are working with, because there are some distinguished differences whenever you create the syntax of these types. Okay, so give attention to this point.